New Jersey woman is found brutally murdered by the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from a few bite marks left on the victim's body. A sadistic predator targets young women in a quiet Canadian community. As police struggle to track him down, the killer threatens more victims. Indiana firefighters discover a woman murdered in her bed. But will dental impressions be enough to convict her killer? Some murderers are compelled to leave a very personal mark on their victims. But with the help of forensic odontologists, police can use those marks to capture those who kill with a deadly smile. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Just after midnight on August 12, 1994, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey were dispatched to a remote area just off Route 1. A battered, semi-nude woman, identified as 25-year-old Melissa Padilla, had been found murdered, lying inside a concrete pipe. Crime technicians began processing the area for clues. They collected several recently purchased grocery items scattered near the body. They also recovered a blood-stained dollar bill and nearby several cigarette butts, which investigators hoped would yield valuable DNA evidence. The victim's discarded shorts, stained with blood, were found nearby. Inside one of the pockets was a store receipt for several grocery items, time-stamped 11:29 p.m. While evidence technicians continued processing the scene, Melissa's boyfriend, Hector Gonzalez, who had found her body, was brought in for questioning. He couldn't imagine anyone who would want to hurt Melissa, a dedicated mother of 4. Hector said that after putting the kids to bed around 11 p.m., Melissa said she wanted to go to a nearby convenience store to pick up a few things. Hector agreed to watch the kids. She said she would be back within a half hour.
Thank you.
When she hadn't returned more than an hour later, he became concerned and asked a friend to help look for her. That's when they found Melissa's battered body along Route 1, the path she normally took to go to the store. Hector later agreed to take a polygraph examination. Test results indicated he had nothing to do with Melissa's murder. Though police had no obvious suspects, the motive behind the murder seemed clear. Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office Lieutenant Lawrence Nagel worked the case.
The woman that was found at the scene was found naked from the waist down. It appeared there was severe trauma to her face area. Initial impressions were that it appeared to be a sexual type of situation.
At autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that Melissa Padilla had died of manual strangulation. Her face had been viciously beaten. Though it was clear she had been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was recovered. More disturbing was the presence of small contusions on the victim's body. The ones found on Melissa's chin appeared to be bite marks. Knowing the bite marks would be crucial in linking a suspect to the crime, an identification officer with the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office precisely photographed them to scale, using standards developed by the American Board of Forensic Odontologists. For the bite mark evidence to be useful, investigators had to identify a suspect. Trying to retrace Melissa's movements, investigators retrieved the security camera videotape from the store Melissa had been to just before her death. Melissa was clearly visible, purchasing the items found near her body. The amount of change she was seen receiving was the same amount found in her pocket. But no one who appeared in the video looked suspicious. Analysis of the items recovered from the crime scene had little else to offer. Though DNA was found on the cigarette butts, investigators had no way to determine who had left them there or when. And all of the blood that was collected belonged to Melissa. A meticulous search for any suspect fingerprints turned up nothing. Despite the lack of clues to the killer's identity, the bite marks he left behind gave investigators a glimpse into his violent mind. Assistant Prosecutor Thomas Capsack of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office worked the case.
The nature of the crime suggested anger. The victim was really brutalized. There had to be a lot of pain involved, and we eventually concluded that the bite mark on the chin occurred while he was looking into her eyes while he was causing pain.
Police began focusing their attention on sex offenders known to be living in the area. A state prison facility housing such offenders was located just a few miles from the crime scene. And several inmates had recently been released. Investigators tracked each one of them down. All denied knowledge of Melissa Padilla's murder. And all were eventually cleared by polygraph examinations. Investigators scoured dozens of homicide cases looking for one with a similar MO. But despite their efforts, 8 months passed with no progress in the investigation of Melissa Padilla's murder. But in April 1995, investigators received a call from the Maine State Police. Authorities there were requesting background information on a Woodbridge, New Jersey resident, 31-year-old Steven Foron, who was in their custody for sexually assaulting a female Maine state trooper. For Lieutenant Nagel, the details of the assault sounded eerily familiar.
It was revealed during a conversation with the Maine State Police that the trooper during the assault by Steven Foron was bitten in the same immediate areas that Melissa Padilla was bitten on.
Hoping this was the break they had been waiting for, investigators traveled to Maine to speak with the trooper, who was still recovering in the hospital. Investigators immediately noticed that the trooper had sustained bite marks on her chin, the same spot where Melissa Padilla had been bitten. The off-duty trooper said she saw a car parked on the side of the road, facing oncoming traffic.
Open the window!
Concerned, she pulled over.
You having trouble with your car tonight?
The driver claimed to be having mechanical problems,
Okay, I need you to
but
step
the
out of
trooper
car,
noticed
son.
a strong alcohol smell.
Okay, stay right there. Okay, don't move. Don't move. Okay.
She administered a breathalyzer test, which confirmed that the man was intoxicated. As the trooper radioed into the station for backup, the man suddenly attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious. When she came to, she was in the passenger seat of her patrol car. She was in a great deal of pain and suddenly realized she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious. Believing the assailant was planning to kill her, the trooper jumped out of the car. The driver continued on. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Her assailant, Steven Foron, was taken into custody less than an hour later. After examining and photographing the trooper's injuries, one thing became clear. The assault on the state trooper and the murder of Melissa Padilla bore the same ritualistic signature.
Ritual involves getting sexual gratification from the crime you commit. The signature in our case really was the ritual, and that is the beating to the eyes and the nose, the bite mark on the chin.
Come over here and check
For
this
investigators, the similar MO of the two assaults had to be more than just a coincidence. New Jersey police went to the jail in Kennebec County, Maine, to question Fortin about the Melissa Padilla homicide. Though Fortin admitted to living in Woodbridge, New Jersey at the time, he insisted he didn't know anyone named Melissa Padilla and denied any knowledge of her murder. He also denied ever being in the area along Route 1, where Melissa's body was found. But he didn't deny his involvement in the assault on the female trooper, though he claimed he had acted in self-defense. Investigators collected hair and blood samples to compare to evidence recovered from the Melissa Padilla crime scene. Though investigators finally had a strong suspect in the young woman's homicide, they were still a long way from proving that Steven Foron was her killer. With only bite mark evidence to work with, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey struggled to solve the brutal murder of Melissa Padilla, a 25-year-old mother of 4.
Why did you move to Maine?
After several months with no leads, police learned of a similar assault more than 300 miles away in Maine. And the suspect in that case, Steven Foron, had recently moved there from Woodbridge. While waiting for DNA analysis, New Jersey authorities interviewed Fortin's friends and associates. They located an ex-girlfriend who still lived in Woodbridge. She had plenty to say about Steve Foron. She said their turbulent 4-month relationship suddenly came to a violent halt after Foron assaulted her during an argument they had while taking a walk along Route 1. She added that after their fight, Foron returned to apologize. The girlfriend noticed cuts and scratches on Fortin's face and hands. Foron explained that he feared she had called the police, and he fled through the woods to avoid them. She believed the incident had taken place on August 12th. Not only was that the night Melissa was murdered, but the girlfriend had put Foron on Route 1, an area he previously claimed he had never been to. Though investigators were now convinced that Foron was Melissa Padilla's killer, DNA analysis on the cigarette butt found near her body was inconclusive. Examiners analyzed all of the evidence found at the crime scene again, hoping something may have been overlooked. But nothing was found. For Identification Officer Jim O'Brien, it was clear that the bite marks would be the crucial link connecting Steven Foron to Melissa's murder.
The DNA results were inconclusive. We had no hairs or fibers from Steven Foron found on the victim's body, and I never developed any fingerprints on any of the evidence that came back to anyone except the victim herself. Therefore, the photographs of the bite marks on the victim's body were very, very important in terms of physical evidence and in terms of putting Steven Foron at this crime scene.
In April 1995, Steven Foron was taken to the office of Dr. Brian Morin, a dentist in Waterville, Maine. To prove Foron had made the bite marks on Melissa's body, investigators first needed models detailing every unique feature of his teeth. First, photographs of the suspect's teeth are taken using a millimeter ruler, so examiners can accurately determine the scale of the photos for later comparisons to pictures of the victim's injuries. Then, impressions of the upper and lower teeth are taken using a substance called dental stone, a material similar to plaster. After the molds are allowed to harden, Morin then grinds them down to remove excess material, allowing examiners to clearly see the unique features of the teeth. The molds of the suspect's teeth, in addition to life-size photographs of the bite mark injuries, are all examiners need to perform the analysis. Dr. Tom Richardson, a forensic odontologist in Portland, Maine, explains the process.
The molds of teeth are the casts. They are the likeness of the individual's teeth in size and in shape. The photos are from the individual or medium that was bitten, and they are life size as well. We take the casts, put an overlay, go up against the marks on the photo, and we either are going to have a match if the photos are good and the marks are there, or we're not going to.
Using a computer program, examiners demonstrated how the casts made of Steven Foron's teeth lined up perfectly with the bite marks on the victim's chin.
Photographs here.
The spacing between Foron's teeth, the dimensions of the arches of his bite, and the unique details of his teeth were all consistent with the injuries on both victims. Detectives now had the physical proof they needed to charge Steven Foron with the murder of Melissa Padilla. Police believe that Steven Foron chanced upon Melissa as she returned from the convenience store. Still enraged by the argument with his girlfriend, Foron brutally beat, bit, and sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her to death. In February 2001, he was sentenced to death in New Jersey for the murder and aggravated sexual assault of Melissa Padilla. He also pled guilty to charges stemming from the beating and sexual assault on the Maine state trooper. He received the maximum 20-year sentence. Steven Foron found gratification in a brutal ritual. But 3,000 miles away in Canada, in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, one killer took perverse satisfaction from taunting the detectives on his trail. Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, October 14, 1995. In the early morning hours, officers from the Abbotsford Police Department were dispatched to a hospital emergency room. There, they found 16-year-old Melissa Connor, still recovering from a brutal beating she sustained a few hours earlier. Melissa told investigators that she and a friend, Tracy Sawyer, were on their way to a party when a man wielding a baseball bat jumped out of the bushes and attacked them. During the struggle, Melissa was knocked unconscious. When she came to, Tracy and the assailant were nowhere in sight. Though her recollection of the attack was still a bit hazy, Melissa was certain she had never seen the man before. Investigators rushed to the scene of the assault to search for Tracy. But only one item found at the scene suggested that a struggle had taken place. A single hoop earring that belonged to the missing teenager. Inspector Rod Gale of the Abbotsford Police Department hoped a canvass of the neighborhood would yield information.
There were witnesses in the area of the crime scene, but the witnesses that we established there had only heard screams in the early hours of the morning, and no one had actually seen anything.
Okay.
Investigators feared that the 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer had been abducted, or worse. And with no suspects to pursue, they knew that time was working against them. A description of the missing teenager and details of the assault were distributed to all area law enforcement agencies. A few hours later, a man fishing along the Vedder River noticed something on the riverbank. As he moved closer to get a better look, he realized he had found a human body. Officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who responded to the scene found that the young female victim had been savagely beaten and raped. Police scoured the shoreline for clues that could help them identify the young woman and her killer. But they found nothing. Still, officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed this was the missing Abbotsford girl. Sergeant Kevin McLeod.
The obvious connection to me to the Abbotsford case was the fact that Abbotsford had a missing girl and we had a dead girl. And this is close vicinity of the two communities.
Dental records confirmed that the woman found at the Vedder River was Tracy Sawyer. The medical examiner confirmed that the young woman had been raped. He also noted massive blunt force trauma to her head. But that wasn't what killed her. The official cause of death was ruled a drowning. The only clues to the killer's identity were bite marks on the victim's torso. The impressions were carefully photographed and preserved as evidence. The photos were sent to the Bureau of Legal Dentistry Laboratory in Vancouver. There, Dr. David Sweet, a recognized expert in forensic odontology, examined the evidence. After studying the bite mark injuries, he realized there was the potential for additional evidence to be obtained.
A new technique was available for recovering saliva from a bite mark, and we could even determine if DNA was available from the saliva and then possibly match that back to the suspect when and if one was made available.
The theory behind the technique, referred to as double swabbing, is that saliva from the suspect's mouth is transferred into the bite marks left on the victim. As demonstrated here, Dr. Sweet first dampens a sterile swab with distilled water, then wipes it across the impressions, rehydrating any saliva cells in the bite marks. Then, he applies a second dry swab to the wounds, which will act as a sponge and collect the rehydrated cells that contain the suspect's DNA. Dr. Sweet performed the procedure on the teeth impressions found on Tracy Sawyer. And though she had been submerged in water for some time, he was confident the double swabbing technique would yield DNA evidence.
Despite the fact that the body had been in water, the saliva is sticky enough in order to remain there, and if you can use some methods to collect that evidence that's there, even in trace forms, you'll have enough to test and to analyze.
The procedure was successful. Minute traces of the killer's DNA was collected. But for that evidence to be useful, investigators would now have to find a way to identify a suspect. A forensic odontologist had successfully extracted the killer's DNA from bite marks found on 16-year-old murder victim Tracy Sawyer. But for the evidence to be useful, police in Abbotsford, British Columbia, now had to identify a suspect. They turned to the victim's parents for information. The couple said that the last time they saw Tracy was shortly before the assault. She and her friend, Melissa Connor, were leaving for a party at a neighborhood friend's house. They promised not to be out too late. Tracy seemed upbeat and excited about the party.
that night. She looked so happy.
The couple couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt their beautiful young daughter. In addition to releasing limited details of the investigation to the media, police also set up a tip line for potential witnesses to call with information. Soon after, a call came in. The man on the other end claimed to be Tracy's killer. He described in detail the bite mark found on the victim's body.
The only people that would know about it were the people at the autopsy, the doctors, the policemen attending the autopsy, and the immediate core team of the investigation. So it had to be the individual that had intimate knowledge of the crime scene to know about that bite mark.
Police traced the call to a nearby payphone and rushed to the scene. But no one was there. Technicians thoroughly dusted the phone for any fingerprints the suspect may have left behind. None were found. A short while later, Abbotsford police dispatchers received a 911 call. During the conversation, which was recorded by police, a man identified himself as the killer. He wanted to know if police were having trouble finding him. He said he would never be so stupid as to leave his prints at the payphone.
Hey, where are you going to be?
He also promised to kill again.
Hello? Are you there?
It's not very often that a suspect starts phoning the police and threatening to attack again, threatening to do the same thing over again, and basically taunting that you're not going to be able to catch me, I'm going to do this again.
Desperate to stop this killer before he struck again, police turned back to Melissa Connor, the young woman who had survived the assault that had claimed the life of her best friend. Though her memory of the events had not fully recovered, she tried to describe the assailant to a sketch artist the best she could. She remembered the man as being a tall white male, balding, but with reddish-brown hair. The information was enough for police to formulate a composite sketch, which was quickly released through the media. The press dubbed him the Abbotsford Killer. A few days later, a woman came forward with information. She recognized the man in the sketch. He appeared to be the same man who had attacked her with a baseball bat several months before. When shown a photo lineup, she picked out a man named John Eller. For the first time in the murder investigation, authorities had a viable suspect. In November 1995, more than a month after Tracy Sawyer's murder, detectives arrested John Eller at his home. He vehemently denied being the Abbotsford Killer. After taking impressions of the suspect's teeth, forensic odontologist Dr. David Sweet compared them to the bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body. But investigators would be frustrated by the results of his analysis.
It became obvious very quickly that the spacing and the shapes of his teeth were much different than the teeth that would be necessary to cause this bite mark.
And DNA samples from the suspect did not match the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite marks. John Eller was eventually cleared as a suspect in Tracy's murder. Soon after, the taunting phone calls from the Abbotsford Killer resumed. Frustrated, authorities came up with a plan. Convinced that someone somewhere knew the killer, they decided to release the recordings of the Abbotsford Killer's taunting phone calls made to police.
The general public were able to hear a large variety of voice characteristics of the individual that was calling us, and that was our goal. We also had that tape on a callback line at the police office, so anybody could call a designated number and just listen to the tape. They didn't have to talk to a police officer. They could just phone and listen to the tape over and over again.
The plan appeared to be a success. A woman who listened to the recordings came forward. She recognized the voice. Detectives played the tape for her again. She told them it sounded like a man named Terry Driver.
You're positive that's your son?
She knew the voice, she said, because Terry Driver was her son. And she knew that he owned a police scanner and listened to it often at his home. Detectives quickly began checking Driver's background. Though he had no criminal record, the 32-year-old printer lived with his wife and 2 kids in the same neighborhood where the taunting phone calls had originated. Terry Driver was brought in for questioning. Though Driver adamantly denied being the Abbotsford killer, detectives collected hair and saliva for DNA analysis. Photographs and wax casts of Driver's teeth were also taken. At the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver, Dr. Sweet looked for similarities between Driver's dental evidence and bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body.
I produced a clear overlay with the biting edges of his teeth recorded on it at life size, and then compared that to the photographs that were enlarged to life size also.
Dr. Sweet identified several unique characteristics in the suspect's bite that convinced him that Terry Driver's teeth were consistent with the bite marks on Tracy Sawyer's body.
He had some chipped teeth as well as some crowding or rotations of teeth so that they were out of position and not where you would normally find them. This made his teeth unique from everybody else's, and those features were recorded in the bite mark also.
But the irrefutable proof came from the DNA analysis. Terry Driver's DNA profile matched the profile of the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite mark injuries. Dr. Sweet's double swabbing technique helped police clinch their case against a sadistic killer.
To answer any questions now without your lawyer present.
Terry Driver was arrested and charged with the murder of 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer and the attempted murder of her friend, Melissa Connor. Based on the evidence, Abbotsford police believed Terry Driver was a sick predator driven by an insatiable need for attention. On October 14, 1995, that craving exploded into violence. As Melissa Connor and Tracy Sawyer made their way to a nearby party, Driver attacked them without warning. After viciously raping and killing Tracy, Driver set out to taunt police and to prove that he was invincible. In October of 1997, Terry Driver was convicted of the sexual assault slaying of Tracy Sawyer and sentenced to life in prison. He received an additional 10 years for the attempted murder of Melissa Connor. Terry Driver was compelled to call attention to his crimes. But in Indiana, another murderer went to great lengths to conceal his guilt. On October 6, 1990, at 11:37 p.m., firefighters in Shelbyville, Indiana, responded to a blaze at a nearby apartment complex. The fire was coming from the bedroom of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, a tenant who lived on the second floor. After extinguishing the fire on the bed, one of the firefighters made a grisly discovery: the badly burned body of a woman. And the strong smell of lighter fluid led rescue workers to conclude that this fire was no accident. After extinguishing a blaze in an apartment in Shelbyville, Indiana, firefighters had uncovered the badly burned remains of a woman lying in a bed. And according to Chief Kurt Etherton of the Shelbyville Police Department, all indications suggested she had been the victim of a homicide.
It appeared a fire had been started either on or around the bed. There was an inverted V pattern, which is consistent with a fire where accelerants had been used. So it was our opinion that the fire had been set at that point.
After confirming that the victim was the tenant, 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, evidence technicians began searching for clues to tell them who had started the deadly blaze and why. Several latent prints were located and preserved as evidence. But later analysis revealed they all belonged to the victim. Investigators also collected 2 different brands of cigarette butts. DNA analysis later revealed the presence of 2 distinct DNA profiles, and neither matched the victim. It appeared Shirley Sturgill's killer, or killers, had unsuccessfully tried to burn away any trace of evidence from the crime scene. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had not died as a result of the fire. She had been strangled to death. She had also been sexually assaulted. But the biological evidence recovered was too degraded for a thorough analysis. And there was more. Several marks were found on the victim's torso, stomach, and thigh. The ME concluded they were bite marks made from human teeth. For investigators, they were the strongest link to Shirley's killer.
That person told us that if we had a suspect, that they could take impressions and he would be able to determine whether or not those bite marks were made by a particular person, because there were some distinctive markings on the bites that would be consistent with someone's teeth not being aligned straight.
What time was it when
Detectives began their hunt for Shirley Sturgill's killer by speaking with her daughter. Angie Carr said she and her mother were very close. She couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She described her mother as a kind, sensitive, and selfless woman who dedicated her life to Angie's happiness and well-being. She was also a wonderful grandmother to Angie's young children. Angie had spoken to her mother on the phone just an hour or so before firefighters were called to the apartment. There didn't seem to be anything troubling her mother. The victim did mention during the conversation that her next-door neighbor, Jerry Donaldson, was there visiting at the time. It was a name already familiar to detectives. Arson investigators who had responded to Shirley's apartment the night of the murder said a neighbor was asking a lot of questions and seemed to know specific details of the crime itself. His name was Jerry Donaldson.
They said that the neighbor was telling several things about the crime that he felt no one else would probably know.
So when did you last...
Donaldson was brought in for questioning. He admitted visiting Shirley the night she died. She had hurt her back recently, and he checked in on her periodically to see if she needed anything. He said they watched TV, and about 10:30, after smoking a cigarette, he went home. When asked how he knew so much about the murder, Donaldson claimed he'd overheard the firefighters talking. He agreed to provide hair samples for a DNA analysis.
Where were you?
Donaldson's DNA was consistent with DNA recovered from one of the cigarette butts found in the victim's apartment. And though he had never denied being there, investigators were convinced he knew more about the murder than he claimed. On October 24th, nearly 3 weeks after Shirley Sturgill's murder, police arrested Jerry Donaldson on suspicion of murder. They also obtained a court order requiring impressions of his teeth to be made. A forensic odontologist overlaid impressions of the suspect's teeth over photographs of Shirley Sturgill's bite mark injuries. Though they didn't line up perfectly, the examiner felt that the two were consistent. But the suspect's lawyers saw to it that Donaldson would never stand trial for murder.
The defense team hired, I think, 2 different odontologists from other parts of the country who had differing opinions than the odontologists we used. The prosecutor and his staff sat down with the defense team and went over the discrepancies, which eventually led to the release of the suspect.
For Shelbyville detectives, the setback was frustrating. The investigation into Shirley Sturgill's savage murder had ground to a halt. Investigators were back to square one, and with no obvious suspects to pursue. Shelbyville, Indiana police struggled to solve the brutal homicide of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill. Though teeth marks had been found on the victim's body, investigators had no other clues to the killer's identity. A year after the homicide, the case was turned over to Captain Bill Dwenger.
One of the things that struck me as odd, it was the amount of anger or rage that was built up inside someone that could inflict these type of injuries on another human being.
After re-examining dozens of witness statements taken over the previous year, Dwenger noticed that several people had commented that Shirley and her son-in-law had not gotten along. Though that didn't seem so unusual, investigators decided to talk with Shirley's daughter Angie again, and to her husband, John Del Carr.
Could I just get a copy of the... Mr. Carr, we're here investigating the murder.
John Del Carr was upfront about his feelings for his mother-in-law. He didn't like her, and they argued often. Mostly about Shirley's constant interfering with his marriage. He said that on the night of the murder, he was with an old Army buddy who was visiting from out of town. He hadn't seen Shirley that day. Angie corroborated her husband's alibi. Though John Del Carr was still considered a suspect, police had no evidence against him.
Okay, I think you need to get on that.
But a month later, detectives learned that John Del Carr had been arrested for murdering a young woman in nearby Hamilton County, Indiana. Though no bite marks were left on this victim, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The same MO as the murder of Shirley Sturgill.
Yeah, I did the girl in Hamilton. That's what I meant here.
Shelbyville detectives drove to the state prison to speak with John Del Carr and obtain potential evidence. But the suspect was uncooperative and refused to answer any questions. Investigators ultimately collected hair and blood samples for DNA comparisons with evidence recovered from Shirley's apartment. At the crime lab, examiners concluded that John Del Carr's DNA was consistent with DNA from one of the cigarette butts found in Shirley's bedroom. John Del Carr had been at the victim's apartment, something he previously denied. Though it was strong circumstantial evidence, it didn't prove that he was the killer. There was only one way investigators could make their case. They needed impressions of John Del Carr's teeth to compare to the bite marks found on Shirley Sturgill's body.
Taken care of.
But so far, they lacked probable cause to obtain a warrant to force the suspect to provide the samples. And they knew that without that evidence, it would be difficult to get a conviction.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We needed to know, and the jury's going to need to know, did we get his dental impressions? Did they match up to the bite marks on the body of Shirley Sturgill? Without that, I'm not sure a jury would be able to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we needed that information, whether it was going to be, yes, they do match up, or no, they do not.
On August 3rd, 1994, almost 4 years after the murder, investigators finally got a break. Angie Carr had since divorced her husband, and now that he was in prison, she wanted to talk. She believed John Del Carr had in fact murdered her mother. She admitted to having lied to police before, but out of fear for her safety and the safety of her children. According to Angie, John came home very late the night of the murder. Suddenly, he grabbed a shotgun, pointed it at her, and told her he had hurt her mother. He dragged her to the room where her children were sleeping and threatened to kill her and them if she ever said anything. Angie told police that John kept up his threats in the following month.
The kids' room.
Besides hurting her bad.
And she believed he wouldn't hesitate to carry them out.
Put a shotgun to their heads and threatened to kill them too.
John Carr's wife, I believe, was genuinely terrified of John. She knew what he was capable of. I think she did what she had to do to protect herself and her children.
It was the break detectives had been waiting for. Angie's testimony was enough for investigators to obtain a court order to force John Del Carr to give teeth impressions. Investigators contacted forensic odontologist Dr. John Kenny, the deputy coroner for DuPage County, Illinois.
I was asked to go to the state prison and to meet with Mr. Carr in the dental infirmary and to take his impressions and any other records as I would need to make a bite mark comparison.
Okay. But John Del Carr still refused to cooperate.
Okay.
Investigators received another court order, this time giving them the authority to anesthetize the suspect in order to obtain the evidence.
It was possible in this particular case to, because of the configuration of Mr. Carr's teeth, several of his teeth were misaligned and crowded, particularly on the upper arch, to take the model of his teeth and fit it right to the injury in one of these positive replicas.
All of the unique characteristics of John Del Carr's teeth matched the injuries present on Shirley Sturgill's body. There was no doubt that his teeth had left the wounds. Police believe that on October 6, 1990, John Del Carr, resentful of his mother-in-law's interference in his marriage, drove to her apartment and confronted her. His anger exploded into violence. Carr beat, bit, and sexually assaulted Shirley Sturgill before strangling her to death. After, he set her apartment on fire, hoping all traces of his crime would burn away. In April 1997, John Del Carr was convicted of the first-degree murder of his mother-in-law, Shirley Sturgill. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Some killers are driven to leave a very personal mark on their victims. When police have little other evidence to work with, they turn to forensic odontologists, who seize upon those marks to take the bite out of a killer's deadly smile. In North Carolina, a Marine's estranged wife disappears without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, naval investigators struggle to determine her fate. The remains of a young woman are found burning near a rural South Carolina road. For 5 years, her identity and that of her killer remain a mystery. In Virginia, a sailor in the United States Navy is found murdered in a vacant lot. Investigators must look among his shipmates to find the killer. Violence is an inescapable reality of contemporary life, and Navy sailors and U.S. Marines are not beyond its reach. When those who defend their country commit murder, it falls to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to ensure that no one escapes military justice. North Carolina's Camp Lejeune is one of America's largest training grounds for the U.S. Marine Corps. But even here, where honor and loyalty are virtues, betrayal and murder exist. On March 27, 1999, Marine Corps Sergeant Whitman Wallace reported his estranged wife, 25-year-old Tanya, missing to military police. Though he and Tanya were separated, their 4-year-old daughter had been staying with him for a few days. Tanya was supposed to pick her up after she got off work the previous evening. But she never showed. Tanya's roommates hadn't seen her either, and they said that her vehicle was also missing. Whitman believed Tanya had run off with another man. The case was turned over to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS, an elite civilian federal law enforcement organization whose mission is to protect and serve the Navy and Marine Corps and their families. Special Agent Robert Bratton, who headed up the major case response team, began the investigation into Tanya Wallace's disappearance.
There were some very real concerns about a mother of a 4-year-old child who was very close to her child leaving without any comment to the family that she was staying with at the time.
A few hours after the missing persons report was filed, word came in that Tanya's abandoned car had been found. Security guards at a nearby store had noticed it sitting in the parking lot since early that morning. An examination of the vehicle's exterior revealed the presence of small traces of human blood on the door handle. Agents and military police quickly spread out and began scouring the area for any signs of the young mother. But hours of searching failed to produce any clues to the missing woman's whereabouts. The vehicle was impounded for a more detailed analysis. Agents had to consider that with an impending divorce, Tanya Wallace might have gone missing on purpose. Looking for answers, agents went to check out her apartment and interview her roommates. One confirmed that recently Tanya had begun dating another man, but he was in the Navy and was currently deployed overseas. Tanya had made no mention of plans to travel. And since ending her relationship with the abusive Whitman Wallace, nothing seemed to be troubling her. The roommate added that since her split with Wallace, Tanya had become upbeat and excited about the new life she had ahead of her. She was committed to her daughter's happiness, and her roommate could not believe that Tanya would simply abandon her 4-year-old, leaving her estranged husband to raise her.
Based on interviews of her girlfriend that she was living with, the fact that she had never left the child alone for any period of time. In fact, was uncomfortable leaving her child with the father for any extended periods of time. We relatively quickly ruled out the idea that she had probably left with somebody willingly.
Before leaving, agents collected Tanya's toothbrush and a hairbrush for future DNA comparisons. Though agents remained hopeful that Tanya Wallace would turn up unharmed, all the signs were pointing to foul play.
When are we going to start searching?
But so far, they had no physical proof that a crime had taken place.
All right, I appreciate you coming down and talking to me. No problem.
Sergeant Whitman Wallace was brought in for questioning.
Free to leave at any time.
He insisted he had nothing to do with Tanya's disappearance. Though they couldn't seem to make their marriage work, he still loved her and their 4-year-old daughter. He said that on the night Tanya disappeared, he had been assigned to work desk duty from 11 p.m. until early the next morning. He said he never left his post. Agents contacted Wallace's assistant, who also worked that evening. He confirmed that Wallace began his shift at 11 o'clock.
And explained that his wife had not picked up the child.
But 30 minutes later, Wallace asked him to watch his desk. Wallace said his wife hadn't shown up to pick up their daughter, and he needed to go back home and look after her until Tanya arrived. Wallace left and eventually returned 2 hours later. Agents realized that Sergeant Wallace had lied when he claimed he never left work that night. Now, they needed to find out what he was trying to hide. They turned to the only piece of physical evidence they had. A week after she was reported missing, NCIS Special Agent and Forensic Consultant Mike Maloney began examining Tanya's vehicle.
As soon as we opened the door, it was obvious that there was a great deal of blood in the car. It couldn't be seen from the outside. The interior of the vehicle was very dark, dark-colored carpet, dark-colored seats and interior. But once we opened the door, it was apparent that there was blood.
The carpet revealed a large blood stain, approximately 16 inches long and 13 inches wide. Examiners removed it for a more detailed analysis. The DNA profile of the blood found in the vehicle matched those generated from the samples collected from Tanya's residence.
Hey, Bob.
It was clear that something violent had happened to Tanya.
Run the pattern a couple
But
of
without a
different
body,
times.
agents were unable to prove that she was dead.
1,000 milliliters prove that she was dead. And
Special Agent Mike Maloney devised a blood volume analysis experiment that could provide them with that
worth
proof.
the time we put into it. We felt that we could show that she had lost so much blood in that vehicle that she couldn't possibly be alive.
Agent Maloney first needed to determine how much blood it would take to create the same size stains as those left on the vehicle's carpet. They obtained carpet samples from the vehicle manufacturer and saturated them with human blood. Examiners determined that 1,850 milliliters of human blood, or nearly 4 pints, was necessary to create a similar size stain. And that would be nearly half of Tanya Wallace's total blood volume. No one could have survived such severe bleeding without medical assistance. For agents, there was now no doubt that Tanya Wallace was dead. And they were equally convinced that her estranged husband, Sergeant Whitman Wallace, was responsible. But so far, they had no hard evidence to prove murder. With no body and only a blood-stained carpet to work with, forensic examiners of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service proved that missing 25-year-old Tanya Wallace was dead. And NCIS special agents believed her estranged husband, Marine Corps Sergeant Whitman Wallace, had killed her. But they lacked physical proof. And Wallace was no longer cooperating. Believing the suspect may have tried to throw away evidence of his guilt, agents began searching the dumpsters surrounding Wallace's barracks. But the trash had already been emptied. NCIS Special Agent Robert Bratton refused to give up. Though it seemed like a long shot, he contacted the area landfill, where all of the trash from the Camp Lejeune dumpsters is brought.
They can tell you where trash that's picked up and delivered that day or any particular day is within just a few feet. We asked them at that point to isolate the trash that was delivered on Monday and Tuesday of that week.
The Marines' Chemical Biological Incidents Response Force located that spot and began sifting through the mountain of debris. After hours of searching, the team found and collected a large green military-issue sweatshirt and some women's clothes. All of the items were covered with what appeared to be bloodstains. DNA tests on the items of clothing showed that all of the blood had originated from Tanya Wallace. And for Special Agent Mike Maloney, it appeared that Tanya had been wearing the clothing at the time of her death, except for one item, the green sweatshirt.
We were curious as to who the sweatshirt belonged to, though. The staining was on the outside of the sweatshirt and saturated to the inside, so we were fairly certain it wasn't something that Tanya was wearing the night that she was killed. We examined the neckband of the sweatshirt and also the armpits, and there was quite a bit of debris, of old skin cells, of sweat and sweat saturation.
Examiners were able to extract minute traces of DNA from the skin cells found on the sweatshirt. Analysis showed that the DNA was consistent with having come from Sergeant Whitman Wallace. Believing they were closing in on Tanya's killer, agents searched Wallace's barracks room. Wallace was in the process of moving out, and the place had been thoroughly cleaned.
I don't know what they'll turn out to be.
When agents applied luminol and darkened the room, large stains emerged on the tile floor.
Yeah.
Tests confirmed that the blood was human.
He got the red out, but that's all we got out. The hemoglobin's still there, and that's what's
But the stains stopped abruptly where the carpet began. No blood was present beyond the tile flooring.
So we've got this line.
Convinced Tanya had been murdered inside Whitman Wallace's barracks room, agents began interviewing other Marines who lived in the same complex.
Thanks. What do you have for me?
One Marine recalled that a few days after Tanya was reported missing, Wallace paid him a visit.
And it's probably no big deal. I appreciate it, man. You don't know how much I appreciate this.
He said that he had an inspection coming up, and the carpet in his room was muddy and it would never pass. Wallace asked to switch the carpets, and the barracks mate agreed. But after the inspection was complete, Wallace never returned to switch the rugs back.
Appreciate it. Look, I'll give you a call, all right? All right, later on, okay.
In fact, it was still lying on the Marine's floor.
You have his rug now?
Yeah.
Hoping the rug contained the evidence they needed to prove Whitman Wallace was a killer, agents collected it and brought it to the lab for testing.
Yes, sir. What you had? Got it?
Agent Maloney examined the carpet.
We did the luminol test, and we found the rest of the missing pattern from that stain by the door. They matched together perfectly, just like a puzzle piece. A very large saturation stain of what was later positively identified as blood on the carpet that matched that pattern that had been so sharply cut off on the tile floor.
DNA testing revealed that the blood on the rug, as well as the blood on the tile floor, was consistent with Tanya's. Agents now had enough evidence to make their case. Sergeant Whitman Wallace was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Based on the evidence, agents believed that Whitman Wallace was unwilling to give up custody of his daughter and was resentful of having to pay child support. On March 26, 1999, after getting off work, Tanya went to her estranged husband's barracks to pick up her daughter. Whitman Wallace had made sure he would be there when she arrived. With the couple's 4-year-old daughter asleep in the next room, Wallace savagely beat Tanya to death. He put her bleeding body into her vehicle, drove to a remote site, and buried her. At a general court-martial, Sergeant Whitman Wallace pled guilty to kidnapping and unpremeditated murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And as part of the plea agreement, Wallace led authorities to Tanya's remains. Even without the victim's body, NCIS special agents were able to quickly expose the deadly violence of a Marine Corps sergeant. But in South Carolina, it would take naval investigators years to unravel one killer's deadly scheme. On November 6, 1989, a man driving along an isolated road in Jasper County, South Carolina, noticed something burning on the side of the road. Fearing it could spark a larger fire, he went to extinguish it. The fire was emanating from a large green duffel bag. And inside the bag, the man saw what appeared to be the charred remains of a human body. He called 911. Deputies from the Jasper County Sheriff's Office raced to the scene. The person found inside the duffel bag was burned beyond recognition, and the skull had been smashed. The only clue to the victim's identity was a unicorn print nightgown that had survived the blaze, indicating this person was likely female. According to Jasper County Detective Sam Woodward, investigators found little else.
Only thing we had was a female body in a duffel bag that was set afire. Basically, that's all we had. We didn't have no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing like that.
Believing that the victim's identity would reveal her killer, police hoped an autopsy would yield valuable information.
The weight? 165, 165.
Analysis of the remains led the medical examiner to conclude that the female victim was Caucasian, around 25 years old, with dark brown hair. An enlarged uterus indicated that she had recently given birth. Her death had been brutal. She had been hit in the head 32 times with a blunt instrument. Police entered what little information they had into a national law enforcement database containing descriptions of missing persons. They also checked all local missing persons reports. But none of the reports matched the description of this Jane Doe. Authorities knew their only hope of identifying this victim was to reconstruct her face as it had been in life. For help, police called upon the expertise of Dr. Ted Rathbun, professor of anthropology at the University of South Carolina. He quickly realized this task would not be easy.
In a complete human skull, there are 22 separate bones of the skull and face. But in this instance, due to the massive trauma, there were at least 122 fragments to deal with. Some as large as the palm of your hand, others as small as half of your little fingernail. So that it really was a jigsaw puzzle, a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
After 8 days, Dr. Rathbun had successfully rebuilt the skull.
I was able to provide law enforcement and the forensic artists with a completed skull that was held together with glue, with supporting sticks and clay, so that photographs could be taken and oriented, representing an individual with a distinctive facial structure.
Forensic artist Roy Pascal of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division was brought in. It was now up to him to bring this victim to life.
We do get that hybrid.
After placing rubber markers at certain points in the skull to indicate the depth of the flesh, Pascal photographed the evidence. Then he began drawing the face of the victim by hand in pencil. Four months after her body was found, Jane Doe finally had a face. Hoping to spark some recognition from the public, the victim's image was distributed throughout the area to the media and to local law enforcement agencies. But no leads were developed. 5 years went by without a break in the investigation. It began to look as if this case would never be solved. For investigators, it seemed that the identity of Jane Doe and that of her killer would remain a mystery. For nearly 5 years, a female victim found burning along a Jasper County, South Carolina road remained unidentified. Although forensic examiners had given Jane Doe a face, her name and the circumstances surrounding her death remained a mystery.
Go one time.
Years of searching through missing persons reports failed to produce a match.
It's just one of those things, It's just...
And by 1993, missing persons cases filed in South Carolina had reached an all-time high. But the rash of reported cases was not limited to the civilian population. Agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service stationed in Charleston were also inundated with similar cases involving military personnel and members of their families. Though they had formed a cold case squad to deal with the volume, their caseload continued to increase. In October of 1993, agents responded to the home of Kathy French. Her lifelong friend, 28-year-old Annie Tahan, hadn't been heard from in nearly 5 years. At the time of her disappearance, Annie had been living with her boyfriend, Michael Palan, a sailor stationed in Charleston. And though Annie and Michael had had a child together in 1989, their relationship had been troubled. Just after Annie became pregnant, Michael grew violent and abusive toward her. He would explode into a rage for no particular reason and threaten to leave her and take their baby with him. Annie began to fear for her life, but she vowed she would never give up her child. A short while later, Kathy moved out of state. And after giving birth to her baby, Annie wanted to join her, but was reluctant because Michael Palan had had her arrested once before on bogus kidnapping charges. A few months later, Annie called her. She was ready to leave Charleston with her baby and come stay with Kathy. Kathy said she wired Annie money for bus fare, but never heard from her again. Since the father of the missing woman's child was a sailor in the United States Navy, NCIS Special Agent Jim Griebus agreed to open an investigation. But given the couple's tumultuous relationship, he had to consider that Annie's disappearance had been intentional.
We felt that maybe she was in a bad relationship with Michael Pallon and that she could have just fled, and that was a possibility we had to rule out.
A records check showed that electronics warfare chief Michael Pallon was currently stationed at a naval base in Hawaii. Agent Griebus contacted agents there and asked them to speak with Pallon.
Chief Pallon, NCIS agents David Smith will talk to you about the whereabouts of Miss Dehan.
Michael Pallon told the agents that on the morning of November 6, 1989, he woke to find that Annie had left him and the baby.
At what location did you see?
He remembered that she'd called a few days later, but didn't say where she was or what her plans were.
So you woke up that morning?
He hadn't heard from her since. Pallon added that his mother, who currently lived in Savannah, Georgia, had since adopted their daughter. Naval investigators didn't believe Pallon's story. For them, there was only one explanation as to why Annie Tahan was not with her baby.
We felt that if she was going to leave, which she wanted to do, she would have taken that child. That was the one thing she wanted, was to take that child with her. She did not want to lose that child. It didn't take us very long to form the opinion that she had been murdered.
Agents believed that Michael Pallon had killed Annie Tahan. But so far, they had no proof. They began reviewing dozens of unsolved murder cases from throughout the state. In one of the files, dating back to 1989, Agent Griebus made a startling discovery.
That was a forensic drawing of a young lady that had been found in Jasper County on November 6th of 1989. And I took this photograph I had of Annie, and I looked at both of them, and I knew right then that this was Annie and that we had just found her.
DNA analysis confirmed that the mysterious Jane Doe was in fact Annie Tahan. And now, Naval Chief Michael Pallon was the prime suspect in her murder investigation.
What's the next step?
Right, I went up to Sled yesterday and I met with him.
But NCIS Special Agent Peter Hughes knew that finding proof of his guilt would be difficult.
The problem we were confronted with was the fact that we were working a homicide case 6 years after the fact. So to start from ground zero and try and put these facts together was going to be a tremendous hurdle for all of us.
Results for the credit card.
Agents and local authorities began by trying to retrace Pallon's movements at the time of the murder.
In Hardyville.
They sifted through his phone records for November 6, 1989. They found several calls placed to a number in Savannah, Georgia, located 100 miles away. The number belonged to Pallon's ex-wife.
Right along the I-95 corridor.
Unsure of the connection, local police obtained her financial records. They found a receipt dated November 6th from a gas station located 25 miles from where Annie's body was discovered. Investigators began to theorize that Michael Pallon had not acted alone. Agents traveled to Miami, where Pallon's ex-wife currently lived. Though she denied any knowledge of Annie's murder, she remembered that one morning in mid-November 1989, Pallon called her. He said that Annie had recently left him and he needed her to help take care of the baby. She agreed and drove to Pallon's apartment in Charleston a day or two later to pick up the child. But the phone records and gas receipts proved that she had traveled to the apartment on November 6th, the same day Annie was murdered. When it came to dates and times, she couldn't seem to keep her story straight. agents confronted her with the receipts and asked if they would help refresh her memory.
You take a great interest in that.
Once she realized we knew she was in that apartment at about the time that Annie was murdered, she knew we had her.
Knowing she could be implicated in the murder, the ex-wife agreed to cooperate. She said that Michael Palan didn't want Annie in his life anymore, but wanted the couple's baby. Knowing Annie would never give up her child, Palan plotted to kill her, and the ex-wife agreed to help him pull it off. In the early morning hours of November 6th, Palan called her and told her it was done, and he needed her help in cleaning up the apartment. When she arrived just after dawn, she noticed blood everywhere. After helping Palan load Annie's body into the trunk of his car, she helped him shampoo the carpets and paint over the blood spatter on the walls. The information had brought agents one step closer to making their case. Now they needed to find physical proof that Michael Palan had done what his ex-wife had accused him of. She agreed to take agents to Palan's old apartment and walk them through the crime scene. Though the apartment was now vacant, the ex-wife was able to point out where Annie's body had been on the carpet. She also described the pattern of blood spatter on the walls and ceiling. But no blood was visible. And after so many years, agents were skeptical they would find any. Still, agents darkened the room and applied luminol throughout the area. To their surprise, blood was still present, and the locations of all the stains were exactly where the ex-wife said they would be. Though the findings had corroborated the ex-wife's statements and provided powerful evidence of Palan's guilt, agents knew it didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the killer.
Because when you look at the facts of the case, a defense attorney can easily say that this was a jealous wife who killed her. Not Palan, but a jealous wife.
Agents needed to get Michael Palan to confess to the murder. With the ex-wife's help, agents set a trap. She would phone Palan and coax him into talking about the murders.
Interesting enough, the opening comment that his ex-wife made was, Michael, they found the body. They found Annie. And his reply was, no, they didn't, which was of major significance in that an innocent person, of course, is going to say, what are you talking about? Body? I don't know, what are you talking about? But now he's on the phone and he's telling us, no, the police didn't find the body.
Got him to talk about the fact that...
After several days of intercepting phone calls, agents had heard enough.
Well, did you hear him deny?
3 weeks before he was scheduled to retire from the Navy, Chief Michael Palan was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Annie Tahan.
Back, please.
Confronted with the evidence amassed against him, Palan confessed to the crime. Determined to keep his child, he said in the early morning hours of November 6th, he returned home from work to find Annie sleeping in front of the TV. Using a blunt instrument, he beat her to death. To conceal his guilt, he placed Annie's body in a duffel bag and drove to a deserted country road. He threw gasoline on the body and lit it on fire. At a general court-martial convened at the naval station in Mayport, Florida, Michael Palan pled guilty to the premeditated murder of Annie Tahan. He was sentenced to 30 years at the Leavenworth Federal Prison.
Ask for comparisons.
Betrayal by a husband or a wife has become all too common.
This is our girl. Or somewhere along the way we lost.
But military buddies claim to be loyal friends to the end.
Those areas. Much of the eyes.
On the morning of April 23, 1998, a man pulling up weeds near an apartment complex in Newport News, Virginia, noticed something lying in the grass. When he approached, he saw that it was a human body, and the male victim had been shot to death. The man went to a nearby apartment and called 911. Officers from the Newport News Police Department responded to the scene. They began searching the victim's pockets for any clues to his identity. Inside a wallet, they found several $100s in cash and an ID card. The victim was 23-year-old Steven November, a sailor stationed aboard an aircraft carrier at the nearby Norfolk Naval Base. He had been shot 5 times. But the lack of any stray bullets or shell casings at the scene, combined with scuff marks observed on the victim's shoes, led police to believe that Steven November had been murdered elsewhere, then brought to this remote location. No one who lived in the area had seen or heard anything unusual. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was a 9mm gunshot wound to the victim's head. 4 other bullets recovered from November's head and chest appeared to have been fired from the same weapon. But with few clues and no solid suspects, police knew that finding this young sailor's killer would be a difficult challenge. Police in Newport News, Virginia continued searching for answers in the shooting death of 23-year-old Steven November, an enlisted sailor in the United States Navy. With little physical evidence to go on, police hoped a search of his residence would yield some clues. Police scoured November's records. One document caught their attention. It was a transaction record in Steven November's name for a 9mm handgun, the same type of gun that had been used to kill him. But a thorough search of the apartment failed to produce the weapon. Looking to uncover any information, detectives contacted the victim's commanding officers at the Norfolk Naval Base. But nothing in November's records suggested any problems. He was a dedicated sailor and was well liked by his shipmates.
He funked it worse than anybody had ever funked it.
Hoping to retrace November's movements on the night he was murdered, detectives arranged to interview his friends and shipmates. Airman apprentice Hector Coleman said he and another friend were with November the night before his body was discovered. The 3 had gone out to run a few errands that evening. Around 10 o'clock, November asked the driver, Carlos Saldana, to drop him off at a nearby convenience store. November said he had some things to do, and he would meet up with them later. He had just cashed a large tax refund check and was carrying over $2,000 in cash. The 2 men watched November enter the store and then drove away.
was a cool guy. Cool guy.
Coleman said they never saw their friend after that.
All right. That's it. Before you go from the ship, there's something outside.
Airman recruit Carlos Saldana, who had been driving the car that night, was also interviewed.
How'd it go?
He told the same story as Hector Coleman. But almost immediately, police sensed that Saldana was not telling the truth. Newport News homicide detective Lorenzo Shepard observed the questioning.
While he was being questioned, he appeared to be very nervous. He was very fidgety. He wouldn't look you directly in the eye, and those normally are signs of individuals who are being deceptive or not being truthful when discussing something.
Detectives asked Saldana to take a polygraph test. When the results indicated deception, he decided to talk. Saldana said the three had gone to the convenience store that night, but they did not leave after November went inside.
About 30 seconds.
The victim got into the back seat of the car a few minutes later, and they drove away. He said Hector Coleman then pulled out a 9mm gun and shot Steven November. The motive behind the murder, according to Saldana, was robbery. Saldana had no idea where the murder weapon currently was, but he knew that the gun belonged to Steven November. Carlos Saldana and Hector Coleman were both placed under arrest and charged with murder. Coleman denied any involvement in the shooting. With Saldana's confession, police believed they had an airtight case. But a month before the case was scheduled to go to trial, an inmate serving time with Saldana in the city jail came forward with information.
I've already been here for 3 months. I don't, everybody.
Carlos Saldana had bragged that he was the one who actually murdered Steven November. He told the inmate that he had pinned it on Hector Coleman in order to avoid the death penalty. The inmate had provided reliable information in the past, and police had no reason to doubt him now.
Just let me know.
Investigators' strongest witness had confessed to being the triggerman. And now, a month before the trial, they were back to square one. Investigators knew that one of the two men in custody was responsible for Steven November's murder. But until they could prove who had pulled the trigger, they knew they could never win a conviction. Police in Newport News, Virginia had two enlisted men in custody for the murder of Steven November, a 23-year-old Navy sailor found shot to death in a vacant lot. Though Carlos Saldana told police that his friend Hector Coleman was the killer, Saldana later admitted to an inmate that he had actually pulled the trigger.
Coleman's been shot.
With the trial just weeks away, investigators were now in danger of losing their case. But they had another option, one that would allow investigators more time to build a solid case. Newport News authorities dropped all of the charges against Hector Coleman and Carlos Saldana and turned the case over to prosecutors of the Navy's Judge Advocate General Corps, referred to as JAG, who shared jurisdiction in the investigation. JAG officer Lieutenant Commander Scott Lang took the case. And with little physical evidence, he had to prove which of the two witnesses was telling the truth.
The challenges in this case were that we had only two witnesses, and both of them had a huge motive to lie. No one wants to get pinned with being the actual trigger man in a murder. So we did not want to commit our prosecutorial efforts to any one theory based solely on the word of someone with a motive to lie.
For help, Lieutenant Commander Lang turned to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service located in Norfolk, Virginia.
Well, I just wanted to give everybody a brief here.
Agent Bill Heath was assigned the case. His first step was to determine the truthfulness of Carlos Saldana's claim that Hector Coleman committed the murder inside his vehicle.
We wanted to go back to that vehicle and determine the feasibility of Mr. Saldana's statement. Could this shooting have occurred in this vehicle as he described? That was their primary objective. Is it possible?
An initial inspection of the vehicle, however, revealed no visible traces of blood or any other signs of violence. The search of Saldana's vehicle was turning up nothing, and it seemed that agents' best chance of exposing Steven November's killer was slipping away. But NCIS forensic examiners are trained to look past the obvious. Special Agent Mike Maloney removed the rear seat of the vehicle where Steven November had allegedly been sitting when the murder occurred. When he split the seat cushions open, he found the underlying foam cushion soaked in blood.
We'll do a hemodynamic to make sure it's blood.
DNA analysis confirmed that the bloodstains had come from Steven November's body. Using a projectile trajectory analysis, Agent Maloney now set out to prove where the shots had come from.
We need to do a test on it just to make sure it is.
Projectile trajectory analysis is a method by which you take the injuries or the wounds that occur to the individual and also any intermediate targets that the bullet may have passed through, be it the clothing, be it the seat itself, a wall, a window. And by lining those up, you're able to determine where the likely point of origin of that shot was.
A mannequin with Steven November's bullet-ridden shirt was placed in the back seat of Saldana's car. Using the bloodstains in the seat cushion to approximate the victim's position, Agent Maloney concluded that the path of the bullets must have originated from the front passenger seat. Since Carlos Saldana was known to be the driver the night of the murder, agents could assume that Hector Coleman had occupied the front passenger seat position. But for Special Agent Heath, that was not enough. He needed to locate the murder weapon, which he believed was Steven November's missing 9mm gun. A short while after entering the serial number into a national law enforcement database, he got a call.
Bullets to New York, we'll do the analysis.
Police in Brooklyn, New York had arrested a man on a burglary charge, and in his possession was Steven November's 9mm handgun.
When the gun was recovered, I was extremely happy that we had found that proverbial needle in a haystack. The next hurdle was determining, is this the murder weapon or not?
After ballistics tests confirmed that November's gun had fired the fatal shots, Agent Heath traveled to New York to find out how the gun got there. The man in custody claimed he bought the gun from a friend of his. Reluctantly, he provided agents with the name and number of the seller. Agents contacted the man who had sold the gun. Fearing for his own safety, he agreed to talk, but only in a secluded spot at a nearby park. When shown photographs of the suspects, he pointed to Hector Coleman, an old childhood friend, as the man who sold him the 9mm gun. Coleman told his friend that he had used the gun to commit a murder, and now he needed to get rid of it.
Once I was able to locate the witness in New York that actually purchased this 9mm from Mr. Coleman, his testimony became absolutely tremendous, because here we have a disinterested third party who, in a casual conversation with Mr. Coleman, was given all the details of the crime.
Though agents have no idea why Carlos Saldana had bragged to an inmate that he had pulled the trigger, they had proven that Hector Coleman had murdered Steven November. Agents believe that before entering the convenience store, November asked his friend Hector Coleman to hold on to his 9mm gun. After driving away, Coleman said he wanted to fire the gun into the air. He asked November to make sure there were no police around. When the young sailor turned his back, Coleman shot him. He then robbed him of nearly $2,000 in tax refund money. Then had Saldana drive to a remote location where they dumped the victim. Saldana later claimed that Coleman threatened to kill him too if he told anyone about the murder. Carlos Saldana pled guilty to 1 count of accessory and 2 counts of false official statements. He was sentenced to 8 years confinement. A general court-martial was convened for Hector Coleman on August 18, 1999. He was found guilty of the robbery and murder of Steven November. He was sentenced to life without parole in a federal prison. Violent crime poses a threat to every segment of society. But when a murder occurs within the United States Navy and Marine Corps, it falls to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to make certain that no one escapes military justice. In Northern California, a man sacrifices everything to prove his sister's death was no accident. A sympathetic detective with a brilliant theory becomes his only ally. A young woman vanishes, and everyone's convinced she's been murdered. Texas investigators have a suspect and a motive, but absolutely no proof. At least, not yet. A sexual predator terrorizes a quiet Colorado neighborhood. When his spree suddenly ends, authorities are left with no way to find him. Anyone can get away with murder, at least for a while. But as long as a murder remains unsolved, it also remains open. And justice favors the unforgotten. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. On February 22, 1985, Palo Alto, California police were dispatched to the home of James and Abigail Niebauer. 56-year-old James Niebauer told the officers that his wife Abby, one of Northern California's most acclaimed poets, had been accidentally shot. When officers made their way inside, they found the 47-year-old mother of 3 dead on the kitchen floor. She had suffered a massive shotgun blast to the chest. Police collected a partially disassembled antique shotgun lying on the floor a few feet from Abby's body. On a nearby table, police noticed polish, rags, and other cleaning supplies. Crime scene technicians photographed the scene. James Niebauer, a physical education therapist for a local public school system, explained what had happened. He said that his wife had left to run errands earlier that afternoon. James had just returned from a skiing trip with his youngest son. He worked to finish restoring an antique shotgun that he planned to give to one of his children as a gift. When Abby returned home a few hours later, he was anxious to show her the progress he had made. While she was admiring the workmanship on the barrel, the shotgun inexplicably fired. James had no idea that the old gun was loaded, nor could he explain why it fired. He couldn't believe that his wife of 27 years was gone. At autopsy, the coroner established the official cause of death as a gunshot blast to the victim's heart. Abby's death had been instantaneous. The examiner also studied the powder burns left on her blouse. Based on their size and location on the sleeves, he concluded the burn patterns were consistent with James's story, that Abby had been reaching toward the barrel when the shotgun misfired. But as news of the shooting began to spread through Palo Alto, Abby's friends came forward to police, convinced that her tragic death was anything but an accident. One close friend told police that James and Abby's 27-year marriage had turned bitter in recent years. The Niebauers, she said, had stayed together only for the sake of their 3 children. In fact, Abby planned to file for divorce after their youngest son left for college in a few months.
God, it will look just great.
Until then, Abby hoped to minimize the tensions in the house by converting the couple's garage into her own apartment. But James refused to let go. He would often explode into a rage, accusing Abby of seeing other men. Abby began to fear for her own safety. Despite James Niebauer's story to the contrary, friends were convinced that Abby would never have approached him as he held a weapon. Forensic technicians examined the old shotgun. After a thorough analysis, they could find no obvious flaws in the trigger mechanism that would explain why the shotgun had spontaneously fired. Nevertheless, when police reviewed all of the facts of the case, they concluded that Abby's death was consistent with an accidental shooting. The shotgun and Abby Niebauer's clothing were returned to her husband. More than 700 miles away in Olympia, Washington, Abby's brother, Lee Sansom, had been following the investigation. Aware of his sister's turbulent marriage, he also refused to accept that her death had been an accident.
Goodbye. I was very much surprised when a friend of my sister sent me a newspaper clipping indicating that the shooting had been declared an accident by the police. That was completely the last thing that I thought would happen.
Abby's brother traveled to the Palo Alto District Attorney's office, hoping to convince them that this case demanded a closer look. Though he had no physical evidence, he believed he could establish a motive for murder. He said that just 2 weeks before Abby's death, the estate of their recently deceased parents had been settled. Abby's inheritance was $180,000. She confided to her brother that she planned to keep it in an account where James couldn't touch it. However, if Abby died before her divorce was finalized, the money would automatically go to James Niebauer, which is exactly how it was playing out. But ultimately, authorities weren't swayed. And Lee Sansom quickly realized that if he was going to find justice for his sister, he would have to come up with solid physical evidence on his own. As he struggled to find a way to expose his brother-in-law's crime, he received a letter from authorities in Palo Alto.
I got a letter back saying that they didn't really feel that there was any reason that the local prosecutor probably knew what they were doing, and that there was no reason for them to look further into it.
Unwilling to accept the official ruling, Sansom made a difficult decision. He quit his job as a computer programmer and began investing all of his time and money to finding justice for his sister.
Financially, I lost everything that I had put aside for my retirement and that I had inherited from my parents. And as I say, there were huge gaps of time in which I was waiting for some results. It was very difficult. Sounds like a good one.
8 years passed without a break. Then, Sansom learned of a survivors advocacy group called Citizens Against Homicide.
Good to hear from you.
They agreed to help him jumpstart the investigation. The group contacted the Palo Alto Police Department and persisted until authorities agreed to re-examine Abby's death. When homicide detective Michael Yore reviewed the files, he was surprised at what he found.
My first impression on this particular case was that there was a homicide that occurred. This was not an accident.
With Lee Sansom's help, Detective Yore, a firearms expert, retrieved the old shotgun and examined it for himself. It left him with more questions than answers.
How could you get a single shot shotgun, okay, where you have 14 pounds of pressure to cock the shotgun? How could you get something like that where you've taken the time to take the foregrip off, taken the time to take the stock off, unscrew all these parts, and then not notice that this is a single shot shotgun that's loaded and cocked?
Take another look into this case.
The finding compelled detectives to reopen the case.
Sorry about your mom.
They began by interviewing the couple's youngest son, who was living at home at the time of the shooting. He told police that just hours before his mother was killed, he and his father had decided to return home a day early from a skiing trip.
6 hours is not bad.
When they entered the house, he said his father stopped suddenly, listening for a sign that Abby was there with another man.
Oh, nothing. Listen, why don't we give
But
you a couple
Abby wasn't home. His father seemed agitated, and then suggested he go out and have fun that evening. The son thought this was peculiar, since his dad rarely let him go out, even on weekends. He went, and never saw his mother alive again. Detective Yore was convinced that James Niebauer had sent his son away for a reason. He didn't want any witnesses to the shooting. But until investigators could find a way to come up with solid physical evidence to prove murder, Abby's death would officially remain an accident. After 10 years, police in Palo Alto, California agreed to reopen the investigation into the death of 47-year-old Abby Niebauer, shot by her husband James as he worked to restore an antique shotgun. Though they now suspected she had been murdered, investigators lacked the physical evidence to prove it. Convinced that something had been overlooked years before, Detective Michael Yore examined the coroner's report. The medical examiner had stated that the powder burns on Abby's sweater were consistent with her reaching out toward the gun barrel when it fired. When Detective Yore viewed the photos for himself, he came to a different conclusion. The powder burns, he noticed, were on the outside forearm area of the sweater.
That doesn't match up with somebody reaching out and being shot directly into the chest. So that's what initially caused me to sit back and say, how else could it have happened?
Once again, on the 21st of
To find out, Detective Yore devised his own forensic experiment using the antique shotgun. With mannequins donated from a department store and white dress shirts from his own closet, the detective set out to replicate the powder burns on Abby's clothing, using James's version of events as his starting point.
22 inches from high.
But that scenario failed to reproduce the same patterns.
The arm is 27.
Yore continued to adjust the position of the mannequin's arms and his firing distance. After several days of test firing, he was finally able to replicate the burns on Abby's clothing. At 11 inches away, the shotgun blast produced identical burn patterns. and the defensive position of the arms suggested that Abby Niebauer knew what was about to happen to her.
And now this changes the scenario from she was looking at the bright colors that were on the weapon itself, voluntarily having a shotgun placed at her heart and doing it with her consent, to her now having a shotgun placed at her heart and her in an Alfred Hitchcock terrified position.
An independent forensics authority confirmed Detective Yore's test results. And now, the Palo Alto District Attorney was convinced that James Niebauer had murdered his wife. James Niebauer, now 69 years old, was arrested at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport as he returned from a trip to Germany. He was extradited to California, where he stood trial for the murder of his wife. Police believe that James Niebauer recognized his marriage was over. And the only way to cash in on Abby's recent inheritance was to kill her before the divorce was finalized.
Abby, can you come here for a minute?
After sending his son out of the house, James loaded and cocked the old shotgun and waited patiently for his unsuspecting wife. As she stepped into the kitchen, he fired, killing her instantly. Later, he staged the scene to appear he'd been cleaning the weapon. In 1999, James Niebauer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. For the victim's brother, Lee Sansom, it was the end of a long struggle for justice, but not the end of the mystery.
I still wonder why Jim Niebauer could take my sister's life after being married to her for all those years, and do it in a, not in an angry way, but in a carefully planned way. And I still wonder how he could do that.
Though some homicide investigations can linger for years without a break, justice has a long memory. And advancing forensic technology can heat up an otherwise cold case. Houston, Texas, July 25th, 1987. In the afternoon hours, a road crew working along a rural highway prepared to finish up their day's work. Without warning, a passing motorist suddenly opened fire. One of the workers was hit in the leg. A co-worker managed to get the pickup truck's license number as the vehicle sped away. The information was quickly called into the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Within a few hours, Detective Marcel Dion had traced the tag to a car dealership owned by a man named Michael Neal. Police went to the car lot to interview Neal about the shooting. But according to an employee there, a young woman named Tracy Jo Shine, Michael Neal wasn't around.
Is he here? Is Michael here?
Detectives asked her about his current whereabouts, but she was incoherent and seemed unable to answer any questions.
What are you on? You want something? You look kind of funny.
Tracy Jo appeared to have probably had a shot or had taken some type of a drug, and I tried to get her to tell me where Michael Neal was, because that's who I was looking for.
The officers asked to look around. Near Tracy Jo, the detective found a bag containing a powdery substance.
Hey, detective, I think you
And
need
in
to
the
come see
back
this.
room, the deputy uncovered a makeshift lab used for manufacturing methamphetamine, a potent form of speed.
Tracy, is this your stuff in this other room?
Though Tracy Joe claimed to know nothing about that, she was placed under arrest. Bobby Neal, Michael Neal's brother and co-owner of the car dealership, was also arrested on drug charges. Now, with drug charges pending, Tracy Joe was willing to talk to police about Michael Neal.
Straight shooting. We're trying to look out for you because this is no.
She said she and Michael were romantically involved.
I really don't think you're
In fact, the two shared a house.
And so what I
Though she didn't know where he currently was, she told police that he was the man who had shot the road worker.
I gotta take you back in the lot.
She said that she and Michael Neal had gone out joyriding in his pickup truck. He was firing a handgun at random targets and thought it would be funny to shoot at the workers. Tracy Joe didn't know that he intended to actually hit them. She said she would be willing to testify against her boyfriend if police agreed to drop the drug charges against her. Until then, she refused to make an official statement. Tracy Joe was released on bail.
When she left that, she told me she would get back with me and help me with the case.
But more than a month went by without a word from the witness. Then, on September 9th, Tracy Joe's mother, Virginia Shine, came in to speak with police. She hadn't heard from her daughter in nearly 3 weeks. Tracy Joe Shine, the star witness in an attempted murder investigation, was now missing. Police in Harris County, Texas, were closing in on Michael Neal, the prime suspect in a random drive-by shooting that left one road worker lucky to be alive. Though Neal's girlfriend, Tracy Joe Shine, had agreed to testify against him, she was now missing.
You know what it is and I know what it is.
Though the timing of her disappearance was suspicious, investigators had to consider that she had left town to avoid having to testify against her boyfriend. But then, Detective Marcel Dion received a call. A woman who wished to remain anonymous claimed to have information about a man who had murdered his girlfriend in their home.
Supposedly, the girl had been placed in a 55-gallon drum of muriatic acid and been dismembered just prior to that. The informant started relating to me the names involved, and she named Michael Neal and Tracy Joe Shine.
The informant heard rumors that the victim's remains had been transported to Michael Neal's car lot in a refrigerator after lying in his home for 3 days. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the premises of the car dealership. Though Michael Neal was not at work, Harris County authorities began searching the area. On the side of the building, technicians found an abandoned refrigerator. It was unplugged and wide open, as if it were being aired out. It appeared to have been recently cleaned, but as examiners soon learned, not thoroughly enough. Debris still clung to its surfaces, including what appeared to be a small fragment of flesh. Investigators collected the sample and sent it off to the lab for analysis. In 1987, DNA testing was in its infancy and required large samples. With such a small sample to work with, examiners were only able to conclude that the DNA extracted from the refrigerator was human and that it had come from a female. The process had consumed the entire sample, precluding any further testing. For investigators, the finding of female human tissue, however, supported the anonymous caller's statements that Tracy Jo Shine had been murdered. Looking to find additional evidence to corroborate the story, police searched Michael Neal's bedroom, where Tracy Jo's dead body had allegedly lain for 3 days. If Tracy Jo had been murdered there, police and forensic technicians could find no evidence to prove it.
You find anything? Anybody find anything?
Michael Neal's whereabouts also remained a mystery. In November 1987, 4 months after Tracy Jo's disappearance, investigators got a break. Michael Neal had been located in San Antonio. He was in police custody for having shot a man in the face. Through his lawyer, Michael refused to make any statements about Tracy Jo Shine's whereabouts. Though investigators believed he was involved in her disappearance, they lacked physical evidence.
If you bring a case like this in front of a jury, and a jury says, well, you know, what if we convict this guy and then Tracy Jo shows up? And it's very hard to, when somebody disappears, to assume that this person is dead.
Investigators would have to find another way to make their case. They interviewed dozens of inmates serving time with Michael Neal, hoping the suspect had bragged about the murder. But other than rumors, no one had any useful information. For months, detectives searched the surrounding area, hoping any sign of the missing woman would turn up. But the investigation into Tracy Jo Shine's disappearance turned cold. And it would remain that way for the next 12 years. By 1999, Harris County detectives had formed a cold case squad to deal with a growing number of unsolved crimes. While assessing old files, they came across Tracy Jo Shine's case report. They agreed her disappearance demanded a closer look. And though more than a decade had gone by, Detective Roger Wedgeworth believed the passage of time could work to his benefit.
People get divorced. Wives are more likely to talk about an ex-husband than they are to talk about a present husband. People aren't threatened by individuals anymore. They could be incarcerated, something like that. So time helps us that way.
How you doing?
One of the people mellowed by time was Michael Neal's brother, Bobby, who had been imprisoned 12 years earlier for manufacturing methamphetamines. His parole hearing was coming up, and now he was willing to tell what he knew.
Whatever.
Bobby said that about the time Tracy Jo disappeared, he'd gone over to his brother's house. He found Michael in the garage, trying to load a taped-up refrigerator into his pickup truck.
This thing out of here.
Where do you want to put it?
Gonna put it in the truck.
The place reeked, and Michael was burning incense to cover the smell. Bobby helped his brother put the fridge on the truck. Then they drove it to the car dealership and unloaded it.
What happened to her? And he told
Bobby said he had no idea what was inside. Though he was being cooperative, investigators felt he had not told them everything.
We felt that Bobby had seen her body in the refrigerator, and we wanted him to tell us. And we felt that because he was incarcerated at that time, that we could possibly pressure him to tell the truth.
But the suspect's brother wasn't talking.
like some help with that?
Still, the information he provided focused the investigation once again on the refrigerator.
You work with us, we'll see what we can do.
And fortunately, Detective Marcel Dion, who had worked the case 12 years earlier, had made certain that the evidence remained in police custody.
I don't know how many times everyone tried to get me to release that refrigerator so that they could get rid of it out of our property room. And I wouldn't let it go because I knew that was the only real piece of evidence that we had.
After dismantling the appliance, technicians went to work searching for evidence. They found and collected several biological samples that had gone previously undetected. Though investigators had no known samples from Tracy Joe to compare it to, the evidence was sent to GeneScreen, a DNA testing laboratory that opened in the year after Tracy Joe disappeared. But the police property room where the refrigerator had sat for 12 years was not climate controlled. And senior forensic scientist William Watson was not optimistic.
I did not believe that there was a good chance of generating a DNA profile from the samples that they had, just because of the condition that they were in and the environment that they had been in.
And in fact, the samples were too degraded for conventional DNA testing. However, a new procedure was being developed. The technique, called mitochondrial DNA sequencing, looks at a specific strand of DNA in the cell nucleus that's passed unchanged from mother to child. Potentially, examiners could determine if the latest evidence recovered from the refrigerator had come from the biological child of Virginia Shine.
It was the perfect type of case for this sort of testing because every other type of testing had been exhausted. And we were up against the wall. There was really nothing that we could say about the samples that were found inside the refrigerator, except that back in 1987, they determined that they were from a human, and that was it. So if we didn't get a profile with mitochondrial DNA, we weren't going to have anything at all.
The procedure was a success. Examiners then compared the profile generated from the refrigerator to those of Tracy Joe's mother, Virginia Shine. The results were a match.
And then we look at the overall pattern.
And in a court of law, the tiny samples were enough to constitute the victim's deceased body. After 12 years of waiting, advanced forensic technology had provided investigators with proof that Tracy Joe Shine had been murdered. On January 1st, 2000, Michael Neal, imprisoned on unrelated charges, was confronted with the evidence that confirmed Tracy Joe's body had been in his refrigerator. Faced with the death penalty, he confessed to the murder.
It's in a strip mall.
He said that after learning that Tracy Joe was cooperating with police in the road worker shooting investigation, his anger turned deadly, and he strangled her to death. 3 days later, he cut up her body, placed it into the refrigerator, and then disposed of the remains. After pleading guilty, Michael Neal was sentenced to 45 years in prison for first-degree murder. When tackling a crime, investigators face two scenarios: a lack of clues to fit the suspect, or a lack of suspects to fit the clues. Fort Collins, Colorado, August 29, 1989. In the early afternoon hours, a real estate agent was showing prospective buyers a home in a desirable neighborhood. As they made their way into the master bedroom, they stumbled upon a gruesome find. The current homeowner, 39-year-old Sarah Dean, lay dead on the floor. After receiving the frantic 911 call, officers from the Fort Collins Police Department rushed to the scene. There, in the second-floor bedroom, they found the victim with a telephone cord wrapped tightly around her neck. Sarah Dean had also been sexually assaulted.
Right.
A spilled cup of water found near her body suggested she had been taken by surprise. Police searched the nearby bathroom.
Chances are this has got a lot.
In the bathtub, they located debris that had been tracked in from the outside. The window was unlocked. For investigators, this marked the killer's likely entry point. Looking to uncover additional evidence, crime scene technicians applied a laser wand throughout the area, which causes the proteins found in bodily fluids to fluoresce. The laser exposed several stains.
Take a picture of this down here for me.
The samples were collected and preserved as evidence. As police processed the outside of the house, they located and collected a palm print on the locked kitchen window. But there was no telling when it might have been left there or by whom. No ladder marks or any other signs of a forced entry were found. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Sarah Dean had been brutally beaten before being sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The medical examiner collected additional biological evidence. And blood typing analysis confirmed that it matched all of the samples collected from the crime scene. It had all originated from one individual. Police turned to the recovered palm print to tell them who that was. Though the lift had provided a clear image of the palm print, a search through databases containing fingerprint records turned up no matches. Until investigators could find a way to tie all of the evidence to a suspect, Sarah Dean's killer would remain a free man. Police in Fort Collins, Colorado struggled to solve the brutal rape and murder of 39-year-old Sarah Dean. And though they had collected incriminating physical evidence at the crime scene, they had no solid suspects to link it to. Using photographs taken at the scene, investigators worked to develop a profile of Sarah's killer.
The guy cleaned up.
To reach the unlocked second-floor bathroom window, the suspect had to climb a fence, grab the gutter pipe, and then swing onto the roof. For investigators, that suggested that the perpetrator was young and agile, most likely a teenager. With an overwhelming amount of physical evidence to prove murder, Lieutenant Jim Broderick needed to find a way to identify the suspect.
I guess there was kind of a sense of confidence the whole time we were working it, is that we were finding evidence of the intruder. It was just a matter of identifying who the intruder was.
Lieutenant Broderick ran the victim's name through the law enforcement database. Sarah Dean's name had recently been entered into the system. She had filed a police report 10 days before she was murdered.
24-330.
According to the reports, Sarah called police after returning home late one night to discover that her home had been robbed. Among the items stolen were a tape player, a red and blue gym bag, 2 bottles of wine, and several pairs of black underwear. But the responding officers had found no signs of forced entry and no clues to the robber's identity. That investigation quickly went cold. For investigators, the fetish aspects of the robbery and the sexual nature of the homicide made it easy to connect the two crimes. Lieutenant Broderick speculated that the robbery might have been a sort of dress rehearsal for the young suspect.
He knew the general layout of the house, may have even known, based on the amount of time that he'd spent in the house, that on the prior occasion, 10 days earlier, that certain windows aren't locked.
Even though the evidence suggested the crime of a stranger, investigators couldn't yet eliminate the possibility that the killer was someone she knew. Police interviewed Sarah Dean's co-workers, friends, and acquaintances, starting with her fiancé. He told police that he and Sarah had recently become engaged and planned to marry in a few months. They were excited about their future together. Sarah was in the process of selling her home so they could purchase a new one together. He had no idea who could have done this to Sarah. Before releasing the fiancé, police collected blood samples. Serological tests later confirmed he was not the killer. Over the next several months, hundreds of local residents, including known sex offenders, were brought in for questioning. All were asked to submit blood samples.
I'll bet you there was 300 to 400 people that actually had blood samples drawn from them and compared to the evidence at the scene, but no one was being matched up.
The search for Sarah Dean's killer was turning up nothing. Then, in September 1989, a month after the homicide, Fort Collins police uncovered a clue. A car that had recently been reported stolen was found abandoned along the side of the road. Inside, the officer collected a baseball cap with the initials DT Jr. written on the brim. Believing teenagers had stolen the car, burglary detectives contacted area high schools and looked for students with those initials.
Thanks for coming in. Yeah, I'll take a seat there for me, okay?
They found one. 16-year-old Douglas Thames Jr. was brought in for questioning.
We found something in it. I was wondering if you recognize it.
When asked about the hat, he claimed that he had lent it to some friends of his a few weeks earlier and never got it back.
You're definitely for sure. Okay.
With his mother present, Thames denied stealing the car. Within a few hours, police had located the two young men. They not only admitted stealing the car, they also confessed to being part of a gang responsible for robbing a few area homes. They showed police where they kept their stolen property. Among the electronics and other goods, police found a red and blue gym bag, like the one reported stolen by Sarah Dean 10 days before her murder. Officers confronted the teenagers with the evidence linking them to the homicide. But the boys denied any knowledge of it.
We did catch up.
And they refused to divulge the names of other teenagers involved in the robberies. Police collected blood samples and palm prints, but none matched the evidence recovered from the crime scene. For investigators, the setback was frustrating.
Over the course of the next 4 to 5 years, there's just nothing coming in. I mean, there's good leads based on people arrested in other jurisdictions for similar crimes, but you know, you do the serological testing, and it just doesn't match up with our crime scene.
6 years after Sarah Dean was found brutally murdered in her home, police were no closer to finding her killer. By 1995, 6 years had passed since 39-year-old Sarah Dean was found sexually assaulted and murdered in her Fort Collins, Colorado home. Though police had collected an overwhelming amount of physical evidence from the crime scene, they struggled to link it to a suspect. The case had ground to a halt. But in July of 1995, all of that changed. A heating technician working on a furnace in a rented house made a strange discovery. As he worked to fix a clogged air duct, he found several pairs of women's underwear stuffed inside. Recalling the details of the Sarah Dean robbery and homicide, he called police. Lieutenant Broderick responded to the call, hopeful that this could be the break that eluded authorities for years.
Up inside there?
Yeah, that's...
When he saw the underwear, he realized they matched the description of those that had been reported stolen by Sarah Dean 10 days before her murder. The detective collected the items and forwarded them to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. There, Laboratory Agent Examiner Ted DeValis located and extracted biological evidence from several of the items. Even though the samples had sat for 6 years in a furnace air duct, Agent DeValis was confident that new DNA technology would allow him to obtain valuable evidence.
I would have been concerned of doing the old ABO typing and some of the protein markers, which are more subject to degradation. DNA is very stable, and again, what we do is we always go ahead and try to develop a DNA profile to see if we can be successful or not.
DeValis was able to develop a genetic profile of the suspect from the evidence recovered from the underwear. When that was compared to the biological evidence recovered from the Sarah Dean crime scene, DeValis concluded that all of the samples in this case had originated from one individual. Having established a physical link between the crime scene and the rented house, investigators raced to find out who had lived there at the time of the murder. Fortunately, the landlord kept meticulous records. He told police that in August of 1989, the house was rented to a family who had a few teenaged boys. One was named Douglas Thames Jr., the teenager who had provided investigators with information 6 years earlier.
Here with their grandparents, I believe.
Yeah, they just came in.
A check of statewide records revealed that Douglas Thames Jr., now 22 years old, lived several hundred miles away in Grand Junction, Colorado. Armed with a court order to obtain blood samples and fingerprints from Douglas Thames Jr., Detective Broderick headed for Grand Junction. With Thames at his job site, where he worked as a roofer.
Detective Broderick, we're looking for Doug Thames. You have one on your crew? Yes, sir. Copy that.
He was taken in for questioning.
You mind coming down for us to talk?
After several hours, Thames remained uncooperative with police.
Doing all right, Douglas? In what city?
Convinced he was hiding something, investigators took handprints and collected blood samples before releasing the suspect.
Go straight up.
After developing a DNA profile from Douglas Thames Jr.'s known blood samples, Agent DeValis compared it to the evidence found at the crime scene and on the underwear recovered from the furnace. All of the samples matched. Fort Collins police had found Sarah Dean's killer. Police returned to Grand Junction, this time with an arrest warrant.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have...
Douglas Thames Jr. was taken into custody and charged with the 1989 murder of Sarah Dean. Police believe that 10 days after breaking into Sarah Dean's house, the 16-year-old returned, slipping in through the open second-floor bathroom window. Thames caught his victim completely off guard. Sarah Dean probably never knew what hit her. For the crime of first-degree murder, Douglas Thames Jr. was sentenced to life. When a homicide investigation goes unsolved, some killers feel safe to put their deeds behind them. Armed with patience and the latest forensic technology, investigators can heat up a cold case and find justice for the unforgotten.